Hi again. We've made it to the third week of the semester, and already we're in chapter 4 of John Vivian's book about the media of mass communication. I hope you're enjoying the course, and again, I hope that these series of PowerPoint slides that I'm narrating for you are helpful to you in your understanding about the role the mass media plays in our lives. Again, we will return to meeting face to face in the classroom in Brant 001 at such time as my surgeon approves me to return to campus. So I appreciate your indulgence in this different approach to learning that we're doing, and I hope it's serving your needs well. Chapter 4, hey, going to keep it short and simple now. I'm trying to set things up for a longer discussion about Chapter 8. You may wonder, by the way, why we hopscotch around in the textbook. When I say hopscotch, we study chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we move over to Chapter 8. And so I'll just tell you that we're going to come back to chapters 5, 6, and 7 later in the semester. That's because the approach that we take in this course is to focus on the history and development of the mass media in chronological order. And so chronologically, the print media were the first to develop, and these go back, 400, 500 years ago, these platforms of books, newspapers, and magazines. And then later in the semester, we'll be talking about those forms of the mass media that have developed more recently in the last, 120 years or so. Films and motion pictures, radio broadcasting, recorded music, TV, the internet. Those will come later in the semester. Well, I promised that we'd move through Chapter 4 rather quickly. Chapter 4 is about the newspaper industry. If we were face to face in the class, I probably would ask the question of everyone, how many of you have read a newspaper today? And I'd probably tap my foot and look around the room, and I probably would see very few hands go up. Maybe one or two in a class of 20 people or so. But the fact is that for a traditional aged college student today, a person who is somewhere, let's say maybe between 18 and 20 years old, the fact is that this generation of college students, the ones that you all compose, you're not newspaper readers. You probably did not grow up reading a newspaper. In fact, you might have grown up in a home where even your parents were not newspaper readers. The newspaper industry and the people who read the newspapers share some common themes. They tend to be older. They tend to be maybe your parents' age and certainly your grandparents' age. But whether or not you guys read newspapers, if you're a traditionally aged college student, the odds are that you probably aren't. So, if we're coming to a world today where the traditional ink on paper newspaper is not as important as it once was, then are newspapers dinosaurs? Are they going to go by the wayside? Well, perhaps. We can't say for certain. It's a little early in the whole scheme of things to predict what the next 25 or 50 years is going to be. But I do want us to talk a little bit about what is that future and what are some of the variables that might impact the future of newspapers. Over on the left-hand side, just a quick rundown. In the newspaper industry, there's a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe divided line of responsibilities. A newspaper, particularly one that's published every day and serves a large metropolitan community, is a very large business. It takes a number of human beings to produce a daily newspaper. And so what we have here on the left-hand side of the PowerPoint slide is a listing of the positions that people in the newspaper business occupy at the newspaper office. Up at the top level, it all begins with the publisher. In many instances, in smaller newspapers, I think it's fair to say that the publisher also is the owner or part owner of the business. Larger newspapers tend to be owned and operated by corporations. And so, if that's the case, just think of the publisher as the one go to person, the one who is at the top of the food chain and is responsible for all of the activities of that newspaper. Now, newspapers have two principal activities. One is to deliver the news, the other is to deliver advertising messages. The editor is the person who is responsible for all of the news content. The news editorial person, or the people in that office, are responsible for producing the editorial opinions of the newspaper that get expressed. Production of the newspaper, the persons who are in that office are the persons responsible for actually operating the printing presses, using the ink and the paper to produce this product that we call the newspaper. Advertising, well, I think that's pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? Those are the people who work in the office who are responsible for working with local merchants in the community to make certain that their ads appear in the paper. And they also work with people outside of the local market in some of the large cities where advertising agencies are located, because the newspaper, many newspapers, also contain advertising, not only from the local businesses, but from national advertisers as well. Circulation is the industry's term for those people who collectively are responsible for getting the newspaper from the printing press to you. It may be, if you're a subscriber, it's the newspaper that gets thrown on your driveway every morning, or it might be that they're responsible for delivering large bundles of newspapers to the locations where the newspaper is sold individually at retail, at the convenience stores, the supermarkets, and street boxes. All of that collectively is the responsibility of the circulation department. And then the business department, really no different than any other business. Somebody has to take care of human resources, of the personnel, all of the personnel who work for the newspaper. Someone has to take care of issuing the paychecks, the tax forms, so forth and so on. That's the role of the business department. So as you can see, a number of individual departments and individuals at the newspaper, when you add it up, when you're looking at a major newspaper, you're talking perhaps 100 or more employees, all just to produce that next daily edition of the newspaper. Chapter 4 also talks about media dominance and influence, and while it may be very true that you guys are not necessarily the readers of newspapers, there are plenty of older adults who grew up on that tradition and continue to read copies of newspapers every morning for the most part. Some still publish in the afternoon, but most publish early in the morning. And these people tend to be those who have accumulated enough wealth and influence and position in the community, perhaps in government or business and industry. Collectively, the audience for newspapers tend to be pretty influential people. And so the role of the newspaper is still an important way for many older Americans to get their news, to understand what's going on in the world, and to read the opinions of others about what's going on in the world. Political coverage remains one of the primary aspects of newspaper content. We had probably to look only at the most recent presidential election to understand just how much ink on the paper was given over to the presidential election. And, for many advertisers, many companies that sell products and services that are bought by older Americans who tend to be, rather well off, the newspaper is still a really good way to capture someone's attention and let them know that your business has certain goods and services for sale. Chapter 4 also raises the issue of the paywall. For 20 years or so, roughly the history of the World Wide Web, the time of the World Wide Web, various newspapers have attempted to put their news content online and to put it behind a paywall. In other words, not to give the news coverage away free of charge. You don't give away the print newspaper itself. And so the thinking has been, well, if people prefer to get it online rather than on paper, then they should pay for it online as well. But as you'll read chapter 4, I think what you'll find is the jury is still out, as they say, on what the success of newspapers and their paywalls are, trying to encourage people to pay to get news coverage online. One of the characteristics of the web, and I'm certain, as the saying goes, that I'm preaching to the choir. In other words, I'm telling you something you already know. We have sort of tended to accept the idea that content on the internet, whether it's news information or recorded music or TV programs, by and large, should be free to us. So, what's the future of the paywall? As the old saying in my part of the mass media world, the broadcast industry, the saying is the answer to that question: stay tuned. This is a chart that appears in Chapter 4 in your textbook. It covers the period of 2003 to 2007, which indicates some of the most recent research. I'm not going to try and take you point by point on this chart. Simply, I want to create one singular impression in your mind as you look at it, and that is over a 5-year period, the 5 years moving from the left to the right. You can see that newspaper circulation, and hence the number of people who are reading newspapers, clearly is in decline. The book also talks about, and I think it's important that we mention at least 3 of the most important newspapers in the United States. The New York Times is certainly not the oldest newspaper to publish in New York City, but over the years it has come to achieve a reputation of being a newspaper of excellence and a newspaper of accuracy. And if something important happens in the world, the place to read about it would be the New York Times. It is the paper of record. In other words, it's recording the history of the world day by day with each issue's publication. It tends to carry significant influence in the thinking of politicians and broadcasters. Those persons who cover the news for television many times get their ideas from stories by reading coverage in the New York Times. The Wall Street Journal, an equally important and influential newspaper, originally focusing mostly on the business world, but more recently sort of generalizing to other types of news coverage. In Chapter 3, you read the biography and watched a video about Rupert Murdoch. And I don't recall exactly, maybe 10 years ago, Mr. Murdoch purchased the Wall Street Journal. And so the question is, what kind of influence does Mr. Murdoch exert on the content of this newspaper? And then USA Today. This is the one that you see at the airports and at the convenience stores. USA Today has been around only for 35 years or so. It was created as the newspaper for the TV generation. Persons who spent a lot of time watching TV and didn't have a lot of time to read the newspaper. Well, USA Today was an attempt to coddle up to the TV viewers, and one of the characteristics of USA Today was the fact that most of the news articles were very short. They weren't lengthy. They were designed to be read in a short amount of time. The newspaper, when it debuted in the early 1980s, was extremely colorful in its use of color photographs, color charts, so forth and so on, which was unusual for its time. But again, it was catering to that audience of people who were conditioned to watch colored news on TV. So, 3 important newspapers. I want to leave you for our lecture today with encouragement to think about the decline of the newspaper industry, and as I said at the outset, to be thinking about does the newspaper industry have a future, and if so, what is that future? So I'll leave this last screen up for you. Compare and contrast the newspaper business model with the structure of another business or industry. And it doesn't have to be in the mass media. Could be a department store or a Walmart. How about the operation of a university and higher education, or a McDonald's or Wendy's or Burger King? Is the way that you understand that newspapers are operated, the newspaper publishing companies, how similar is that model of operation to operating a university or a McDonald's or some other retail business? How similar or maybe how different is it? I'll leave that up to you to think about, and I'll see you in Chapter 8's lecture coming up.